Hi, everybody. We'll get started in just a minute. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Vanessa. I'm a qualitative and quantitative mentor here at Statistics Solutions. And today I will be presenting on how to present your quantitative methods chapter. So before we get started, you'll notice there are some links in the chat. We're providing some free resources and different information and links that might be helpful to you all as you start drafting your chapter. Here at Statistics Solutions, we do provide full dissertation consulting from the very beginning, so topic development all the way through to your final PowerPoint presentation defense. So if you need help, please feel free to reach out. We also do provide a 30-minute consultation. It's completely free, where we can help figure out how we can best support you. We do have qualitative, quantitative, and research mentors on staff, so we'd help with chapters 1 through 5, and then also any proposal or presentation materials that you might need. So there's some information here on this slide, and I'll share the contact information later on as well. So just to get started, this is basically an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So again, this webinar is on quantitative methods. So we'll be focusing specifically only on quant today. If you're looking for different resources on qualitative methods, we do have other webinars in our webinar archive library. So please feel free to reach out and check those out. First, we'll talk about the purpose of the methodology chapter and why it's important for the dissertation, and then we'll talk about the different components that are required for the chapter. So the introduction, research method and design, population and sample, instrumentation, data collection, and analysis procedures. We'll also talk about the limitations and the different ethical considerations for your study. And then at the end of the presentation today, I will open it up for question and answer. So if you have questions throughout, feel free to pop those in the chat or in the Q&A section, and then I'll do my best to answer those at the end. I will say if you have questions that are very specific to your research study, it may be helpful to reach out to me directly or to our team directly for those, just to make sure we fully understand the purpose of your study before we're, giving consultation on different types of methods that you might want to use. So first, let's talk about the purpose of your methodology chapter and why it's important for the dissertation. So the purpose of the chapter is to describe how you're going to be conducting your research. Earlier on in your dissertation, you will really talk about the why for your research. So in the introduction and the literature review chapters, you'll establish why you plan to conduct the research and why it's important to the field of literature. Once you get to this chapter, it's time to really start describing how you plan to carry out that research. So how you're going to collect the data, how you're going to analyze it, and how you plan on answering the research questions that you've outlined. The important thing to keep in mind here is that this chapter should be detailed enough so that another reader can read it and completely replicate your study. So a lot of people like in the methodology chapter to an instruction manual, you're basically going to be creating that step-by-step list on how you collected your data all the way through to how you analyzed it. One thing I always mention to students is that when you start writing, it's really important to check in with your chair or your committee to see if there's any particular template that they recommend, just to make sure that you're including any components that your school requires. This presentation is a really good starting place if you don't have a resource like that, but if you do have it available to you, it's definitely a good place to start. So now let's talk about the different components again. So in the introduction, very similar to all of the other introductions that you've written so far in the dissertation, you are going to restate the study purpose or problem statement. And when you do that, you want to make sure that you are keeping your language as consistent as possible from other chapters, really thinking here about the impact that different language and different words will make. So make sure that you are maintaining like a verbatim restatement from the previous chapters for your purpose and problem statement. You may also want to restate your research questions here, and the same, these research questions should be restated verbatim in the same way that they appear in the other chapters of your dissertation. And then you'll want to preview or outline the sections that are going to be coming up in this chapter. So I like to think of this as looking backwards, so reminding and reorienting the reader to why your study is being conducted, and then giving them a preview of what you're going to be talking about in the methodology chapter. One of the first things that you usually talk about in this chapter is going to be the selection justification for your research design. So you want to state the research design that you selected and provide a rationale for why you selected that design. It's important to note that some schools will require you to not only discuss the specific research design within the quantitative framework, but also the selection for the general research method. So the general research method in this case would be quantitative, as opposed to, say, a qualitative or mixed method study. And then the specific research design is going to be within quantitative. So that could be a correlational study, an experimental study, quasi-experimental, whatever it is that you choose. You'll want to make sure that you are describing what that study is used for, and also bringing in examples of alternative studies to show that you've really done your due diligence to select your specific study. In terms of research design, again, you want to state the specific design within that quantitative framework and state how you ruled out other designs that you may have considered. So for example, if you selected a correlational study, why did you decide to do that? And that rationale should really be driven and aligned with the problem and the purpose of your research questions and your study. So if you did select a correlational design, you may rationalize that based on your problem, purpose, or your research questions. It could be that your study is looking at relationships and you want to do a correlational study to see how these relationships interact with each other. So that would be some rationale for why you selected a correlational design. You may also point out in this section that the reason that you didn't select an experimental design is that you couldn't manipulate certain variables, so an experimental design wouldn't be appropriate. So that's kind of the process that you want to go through here, kind of explaining what you chose to do and then the different reasons for why you didn't select other designs. Next, you're going to talk about the population. And I see a lot of students get confused in this area, just kind of conflating population and sample. So it's important to note that they should not be used interchangeably. The population is going to be the broad group of individuals or people that your results are intended to generalize to, whereas the sample is going to be the actual people that participated in your study. So say, for instance, you're doing a study in education and the individuals that you're attempting to study are teachers. In that case, your population might be teachers, and then your specific sample would be maybe the high school teachers that you were able to get to take the survey for your study. So really just remembering here that the population is the larger group and then the sample is going to be the smaller group. So in the population section, you'll want to identify your population of interest and then describe any characteristics about that population. And one way that you can do that is through using resources like the Bureau of Labor Statistics or similar organizations to get basic statistics or characterizations about that population. So some things that you may want to report are the sample size, maybe the demographic breakdown, anything like that that provides useful information to the reader about the population that you are studying. And then again, just reminding that the population is different from the sample. So the sample is just going to be the individuals from the population that you were able to get to participate in your study. So the sample is going to be those very specific individuals that you've selected and invited to participate. So for instance, you are doing a study of high school teachers in the United States. You may be sending out a simple survey. In that case, you are going to be sending out the survey to the broader population, and then those who respond are going to be qualified as your sample. To get a better idea about this distinction, you can kind of think of it in terms of if you were to go fishing. So if you cast your fishing pole, you are casting it into that general population. All of the fish in the lake are the fishing pole, and then your sample are the ones that you take home that day. In this section, you'll also want to talk about the different sampling methods. So there are a lot of different techniques that you can use. They're probably generally going to be broken down into probability and non-probability sampling. Probability sampling would be something like random sampling, where you're picking individuals from the population at random. So here you'll just want to describe what sampling method you intend to use. And then you'll also want to describe how the sample will be selected from the population. So will you be recruiting them via email? Will you be recruiting them using in-person recruitment, maybe standing somewhere handing out flyers? Whatever that process looks like for you, you just want to describe it here. You may also need permissions from a particular organization or institution to recruit there. So you may want to talk about that as well. And then in a quantitative study, you may also want to calculate a target sample size. In that case, you would use power analysis. I'm not going to get too into power analysis today because we do have webinars dedicated to that topic. So if you have questions around that, please do check out our webinar archive library for those slides. But in general here, really just digging down into the step-by-step of how you're recruiting this population and how they are getting engaged in your study. So next, let's talk about the instrumentation. So in the instrumentation section, you want to lay out and describe each of the instruments that you're going to use to measure the different variables in your study. So by the end of this section, you should have described what instrument you're going to be using to measure each variable that you've laid out in your research questions. So again, every single variable that you've listed or mentioned in your hypotheses or in your research questions should have some kind of instrument that is being used to measure it. And there are a lot of different kinds of instruments that you can use depending on the specific variables that you're looking at. Usually in the social sciences, we think of instruments as surveys. So you may use a survey measuring something like self-efficacy or depression or self-esteem. Other instruments that could be used are things like height, weight, more biological type of instruments, maybe blood pressure, things like that. So if you are doing a survey study, you'll want to make sure that you describe the instrument. So you can pull in literature from your chapters 1 and 2 to describe where the instrument has been used in the past, what populations it has been used for, and to provide any indications about the instrument's validity. So really showing that this instrument is appropriate to use for your study. And then if you are doing a study that's more biomedical in nature, using those instruments like height, weight, blood pressure, or things like that, you may want to discuss the devices that you're using to collect that data and where they've been used in the past. In addition to describing the instrument's validity, you'll also want to talk about how it's scored and the different response items for it. So if you've got questions that are using Likert scales, maybe a scale of 1 to 7, you'll just want to describe what each score means. So if higher scores indicate greater alignment or less alignment, whatever that looks like for your instrument, you'll just want to describe that here. You'll also want to let the reader know how many questions are within the instrument. And if you plan on giving multiple instruments, so if you're giving multiple surveys, you'll want to talk about the order that you intend to give them. So if you're going to be giving like the Beck Depression Scale and then maybe a demographic questionnaire, just laying out the plan for how you plan on collecting that data. Here you'll also want to talk about, will you be collecting this data in person or will you be collecting it virtually? Again, just outlining that step-by-step process. And then that gets into the data collection procedures. So a lot of the pieces from instrumentation kind of bleed into this. So in addition to talking about how you're going to be collecting the data, whether that's in person or online, you also want to talk about how participants are going to be providing consent to participate in your study. So most of you will probably have to go through some sort of IRB approval in order to do your study. So this is a good place to be thinking about those consent forms. So are participants going to be signing a paper to indicate that they're agreeing to consent? Are they going to be giving a verbal consent? Will you be having them email you? Whatever the process is, you just want to make it clear here. And this section here should really detail everything in between when you get the IRB approval all the way through to when you analyze the data. The next section is going to be the data analysis plan. So after you've collected all of the data, you'll want to lay out the plan for how you plan to analyze it and answer each of your research questions. So in your data analysis plan, you want to make sure that there's a specific answer for each research questions. So you want to describe how the data is going to be compiled or entered into an electronic format. So for example, if you are taking a paper pen survey, how do you plan on getting that data ready to be analyzed? Are you going to be typing it into Excel, maybe Microsoft Word? Whatever the process is, you'll want to describe that here. And then you'll also want to describe how you intend to ensure that the data is accurately captured. So maybe you're working on a research team and having 2 people enter the data just to make sure that it's really clean and being entered correctly. You'll want to talk about that here as well. Next, you'll want to talk about the different softwares that you intend to use for data cleaning and analysis. So some softwares I see students use are SPSS, SAS, R, even Excel. You'll want to talk about that, let the reader know which software you're going to use, and then describe how you plan on cleaning and preparing the data. So some things to consider when you're cleaning the data: if a participant doesn't answer specific survey questions, how are you going to handle that missing data? That may look like simply removing participants who didn't answer those questions. It may look like taking some mean scores and filling in those answers. It's really up to you how you plan to do that and what's most appropriate for your study, but it's important here to note that for the reader. You'll also want to talk about how you intend to confirm eligibility criteria. So for example, if you send out an online survey and you get, maybe 150 responses, but 50 of the people that responded didn't answer the correct way for screener questions, so they're not eligible for your study. You'll just want to describe to the reader here what you do with those cases. So are you throwing those cases out? Do you have screening questions at the top of your survey? How are you ensuring that the people in your study are truly eligible for the study? Next, you'll want to talk about any descriptive statistics that you intend on conducting. So that could be looking at average ages, maybe just looking, across your specific variables to see the averages across your variables. You'll just want to talk about that as well. And then this is really the meat of it. So you want to talk about the analysis that's going to answer your research question. So depending on what your study is, it could be that you're running an ANOVA, maybe a t-test. Each particular research question should have an analysis plan that's going to answer that with the variables that you've described. And then the last piece of the data analysis plan is describing the assumptions of each analysis that will be tested. So going back to that t-test example, if you were to conduct a t-test, in order to do that, you need to make sure that your data conforms to the specific assumption. So with a t-test, it may be that you need the data to be normal and there should be homogeneity of variance. So in order to do that, you may have to run additional tests to make sure that your data meets those standards. So you might look at a histogram to see if your data is normal. Each test is different. Each test has different assumptions. So here you'll just describe what the assumptions are for your test, how you plan to test those assumptions, and then also what you're going to do if those assumptions are not met. So if your data is not normal and you want to use a specific test, are you going to consider using alternative tests, like a non-parametric test that doesn't require normality? Really just thinking through what that process is going to be for your study. And then some schools may require you to also discuss the limitations of your research design. It's possible that in earlier sections of your dissertation, you've already done this. But in this section, you really just want to be specific to the limitations of the design. So each research design has different limitations associated with it. I've listed some of them out here on the slide. So depending on your design, you'll want to really dive into the literature and see what the limitations of it are. So if you are doing a survey study, some limitations may include response bias. It may be that participants are responding in a particular way because they want to be perceived in a better light. So just thinking those things through. If you're doing a longitudinal study or something like pre-test, post-test research, there are different threats to validity that can be limiting your study. So things like attrition, testing effects, history or maturation, those are some different things to consider when your study is longitudinal. And then in experimental research, some limitations may stem from external validity. So how well can the results of your experiment be applied to real world situations? In this section, you want to discuss the limitations that are relevant to your specific research design, and also discuss any steps that you may be taking to mitigate those limitations or the possible threats to validity. So for instance, if you are doing a survey study and one of the limitations or threats to validity could be response biases, then maybe one way that you can help reduce that bias is by ensuring that participants know that their responses are going to be anonymous or kept confidential. So that knowledge may encourage participants to be open and honest on the survey questions. So kind of just thinking through what you can do as the researcher to limit any potential limitations or biases. And then usually one of the last sections of the methodology chapter is the ethical considerations. And this is where you're going to describe the different ethical issues that are relevant to your research. Usually the ethical issues are based on the principles that are laid out in the Belmont report. So the three main principles are beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. And usually schools will want you to talk about these three principles and specifically how you intend to uphold them in your study. You may also want to talk about your IRB approval and talk about any permissions that you needed to obtain in order to conduct your research. Here you may go into some discussion around your informed consent process and how you developed your informed consent sheet. And then also just talking about how you ensured that ethics were upheld in your data collection procedures. When you are thinking about informed consent, it's important to make sure that in the consent process, participants are made aware of any potential risks that are involved in participating with the study. You should also let them know how their data is going to be protected. So those are things to think about when you're writing this piece as well. And then in terms of talking about risks involved in the study, that's something that you also want to discuss in this section here. So a lot of students make the mistake of saying that their research doesn't involve any risk, which technically isn't really true because all research involves some kind of risk. So typically, if it's a very low risk study, what you'll want to say is that it only involves minimal risk. So here you'll just want to identify what that risk level is, and that's something that you've probably already done for the IRB, and describe it here. If you have a study that the topic may be intense or elicit some kind of emotional reaction from participants, one thing to consider here is talking about how you're going to help participants through that. So if maybe you have a survey that talks about depression or some of these more difficult topics, one way that you may be able to uphold some ethical considerations is to provide resources to the participants in case they experience any distress as a result of answering the questions in your study. Another way could be if you are in person, you can have people on hand that are there to, meet with participants if they have an adverse reaction to the study and maybe need to talk things through. And then it's also important to include in your consent form that participants know that the research is completely voluntary and that they can discontinue their participation at any point without any negative consequences. Especially if your study involves minimal risk, you just want to be as detailed as possible on how you're going to handle those potential risks and ensuring that there's no harm that comes to participants. And then now in this virtual world that we live in, if you are conducting any type of virtual data collection, you really want to be cognizant of how the data is going to be stored, how you're going to ensure that it's very safe and anonymous, and then what you're going to do with it afterwards. So what is the process for destroying the data once you've completed your study? But that does bring us to the end of the presentation today. Here on this slide, there are some resources. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or again, you can reach out to us. We do offer a free consultation where we can give you some more directed feedback if you're looking for it. Yeah, so these slides will be available on our website, but we'll also send them out to you within 48 hours. You're welcome, Wendy. Thanks for joining.